Before my surgery, my wife texted, "I want a divorce. I don't need a sick husband." The woman in the next bed held my hand. "If I survive this, we should just get married," I said. She laughed once. Then a nurse walked in and went completely white. "I want to back up. Not 3 weeks this time. Further than that. I want to back up 11 years. To a Tuesday evening in October when I was 29 years old and standing outside a bar in the rain because my umbrella had snapped in the wind and I was refusing to admit defeat and go back inside. My wife, she wasn't my wife yet. She was just a woman I had met 40 minutes earlier at a mutual friend's birthday. She came outside and stood next to me and looked at my broken umbrella and said nothing. Just stood there in the rain with me. For about a full minute, neither of us said anything at all. Then she laughed and said, "You know you can just go back inside." And I said, "The umbrella is a matter of principle." And she said, "That's the most structurally unsound principle I've ever heard." She knew I was an engineer. She'd asked what I did within the first 10 minutes, and when I said structural engineering, her eyes had done this thing. Not the glazing over that most people's eyes did, but a kind of sharpening, like she had found the corner piece of a puzzle she'd been working on for a while. She had opinions about bridges, real ones, informed ones. She'd grown up near a suspension bridge, wondering how the cables held. We stood in the rain for another 10 minutes. By the time we went back inside, I had her number in my phone and a completely ruined pair of leather shoes, and I didn't care about either of those things, even slightly. We were married 2.5 years later, 43 people in a converted warehouse space. She wore something ivory and simple from a vintage shop she'd altered herself. The photographer said we were the most relaxed couple he'd ever shot. We weren't nervous. We were just glad to be doing the thing we'd already decided to do. For the first 4 years, I would have told you without hesitation that I was one of the luckiest people I knew, not in a boastful way, just in the quiet, private way of someone who has found the arrangement of their life unexpectedly comfortable. We had a house, a 2-bedroom we'd bought when the market briefly dipped, in a neighborhood we liked for its proximity to a good coffee shop and its distance from both of our families. We had a dog named Henderson, a 7-year-old rescue mutt with one ear that pointed up and one that folded over who had come as part of the deal when she moved in. I had not expected to become a dog person. Henderson corrected this oversight within the first week. We had routines. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, Thursday evenings when she brought work home and spread it across the dining table, and I sat at the other end with my own drawings, and we occupied the same space in comfortable parallel silence. There is a particular intimacy in working quietly beside someone, in knowing that their presence is enough and you don't have to perform or explain yourself. I don't know exactly when that started to change. That's the honest answer. And I've spent enough time in retrospect trying to identify the precise moment that I've made peace with the fact that there probably wasn't one. It was more like a tide going out, slow, measurable only in comparison to where the water used to be. The Thursday evenings became less frequent first. She had a promotion at 32 that changed the texture of her work. More travel, more dinner obligations, more of her attention consumed by the job in ways that left less of it available for anything else. I understood that. I had my own periods of professional intensity when a project demanded everything I had. We had always given each other room for that. The understanding was implicit and seemed solid, but the room kept expanding. The travel increased. The dinner obligations multiplied. The professional intensity that I had assumed was a phase became the baseline, and then slowly became the atmosphere of our entire life together. And the question of when it would ease became first a joke between us, and then something we stopped talking about because every time it came up, she got tired in a specific way that made me feel like I was adding to her load by mentioning it. I adapted. I cooked dinner alone more often. I walked Henderson alone more often. I stopped suggesting things on weeknights because the answer was usually not tonight, and after a while, I didn't want to keep compiling the knots. I told myself this was maturity, that long marriages moved through phases, that what we had was still real beneath the busyness and would resurface when the busyness eased. I was 40 when the tiredness started, not the kind of tired that sleeps off, the kind that sits behind your eyes at 7 in the morning before you've done anything yet. I assumed it was work. I had 3 projects running simultaneously and was averaging about 5.5 hours of sleep a night, and that is not, it turns out, a sustainable arithmetic. I cut back on caffeine. I started sleeping earlier. The tiredness didn't move. My GP referred me in March. Hepatic mass, 3 centimeters. The imaging was suspicious. The specialist at St. Augustine's was a man named Dr. E. Patel, who had the calm, economical manner of someone who had delivered this category of news many times and had learned that the kindest approach was clarity. He laid out the situation, the options, the timeline. He answered every question I asked. He was, I think, an excellent doctor. I wrote everything down in a small, spiral-bound notebook I'd had in my jacket pocket since a client meeting that morning. The handwriting got a little less steady as the appointment went on, but I kept writing because it gave my hands something to do. I drove home. I sat in the car in the driveway for about 12 minutes. Henderson barked once from inside the house, recognizing the sound of my engine, and then went quiet when I didn't come in immediately. Eventually, I got out of the car. My wife was at the kitchen counter with a glass of wine, still in her work blazer. I told her. I used the words the doctor had used because I didn't want to soften them into something less accurate. Hepatic mass, suspicious imaging, surgery. She set the glass down. She listened, and when I finished, she asked a precise, practical question question about my leave policy at work. Not, are you scared? Not, what do you need? Not, come here. Just, what's the timeline for your leave? I answered it. I told myself it was her way. That practicality was a form of love. That some people respond to fear by going immediately to logistics because logistics are manageable and the fear isn't. I had told myself this kind of thing before. I was practiced at it. She came to the first appointment, the pre-surgical consultation, 2 days after my diagnosis. She sat beside me and asked 2 questions and listened carefully to the answers. And when we walked out to the parking lot afterward, she squeezed my hand once and said, "It's going to be fine," and then she had to take a call. That was the only appointment she came to. After that, there was always a reason. A meeting that couldn't be moved, a presentation that had to be finished, a trip that was already scheduled. Each reason was individually plausible. Collectively, over 6 weeks, they mapped a shape that I was not quite willing to look at directly. I went alone. 7 appointments over 6 weeks. I sat in waiting rooms with my notebook. I made notes in my careful, increasingly steady-again handwriting, and I took the notes home and put them on the kitchen counter in case she wanted to look at them, and she said she'd look at them later, and I don't know whether she ever did. The nights were quieter than they had been in years. Not companionable quiet. The other kind. The kind where you are both in the same bed, not touching, not talking, and the distance between you has a specific weight to it that you can feel without measuring. I told myself I was projecting, that I was scared, and reading the fear into her behavior, and that once the surgery was done and I was on the other side of it, things would normalize. I had always been good at finding the explanation that let me keep going without having to look too hard at what I was actually looking at. The surgery was scheduled for a Wednesday, 6 weeks from diagnosis to OR. The night before I was meant to check in, I made dinner. Nothing complicated. Pasta, a sauce from scratch because the activity of it was calming, the specific focus of chopping and timing and adjusting. Henderson sat under the kitchen table as he always did, positioned with mathematical precision below the point where things were most likely to fall. She came home at 8:15, ate without much conversation, said she was tired, kissed me on the cheek at 9 o'clock and said she would be at the hospital by the time I was out of recovery and that everything was going to be fine. I believed her, even then, even with everything my peripheral vision had been registering for months. I believed her because I had spent years being very good at believing her, and you don't undo years of practice in a single evening. I lay awake for a long time after she went to sleep. I listened to Henderson breathing from his spot at the foot of the bed. I thought about the surgery, about the mass, about the word margins, which Dr. Patel had used in a context that was technically reassuring, but which had a way of expanding in the dark to fill whatever space was available. Eventually, I slept. I checked in at 11 the next morning. She was at work. That was fine. Logical. The surgery wasn't until early afternoon, and there was no reason for her to miss a morning of work, to watch me sit in a waiting room in a hospital gown. I told myself this was sensible. I had my notebook. Pre-op prep took about 2 hours. Blood pressure, IV line, paperwork, more questions from the anesthesiologist, the particular institutional smell of a hospital in the middle of the day, antiseptic and cafeteria food, and something underneath both of those that I couldn't identify and that I decided not to try. The ward was quiet in the way hospital wards are quiet in the afternoon. Not peaceful, but subdued, as if the building itself understood that this was not the time for anything louder than necessary. My room was a double. The other bed was occupied. The woman in bed 2 had dark hair loose around her shoulders and the particular pallor of someone who had been in a hospital long enough for the lighting to strip away everything that wasn't essential. She was looking at the ceiling. She didn't look over when I came in, just said, without any particular inflection, "It doesn't get more interesting." I said, "I'm sorry?" "The ceiling," she said. She turned her head slightly. "I've been staring at it for 3 hours. It doesn't have any answers." I looked at the ceiling. Standard acoustic tile, institutional off-white, a hairline crack running about 18 inches along the joint nearest the window. I said, "No, it doesn't look like it does." She made a small sound that might have been agreement. "What are you in for?" she asked. "Liver," I said. She nodded with the gravity of someone who understood the weight of one-word medical explanations. "Thoracic," she said. "They keep calling it a mass. I've started calling it the uninvited house guest." I said that was a better name for it. She said most things were better with better names. We didn't introduce ourselves for another 20 minutes. When we finally did, she just said her first name and I said mine, and we left it at that. She had been in the hospital for 3 days already, waiting for a surgical slot, and she had the slightly unmoored quality of someone who had been stationary for too long, a restless precision to her attention, like a very capable person who had been temporarily stripped of all the things they used their capability on. She asked what I did. I told her. She asked if I actually worked on bridges or if that was a figure of speech kind of engineering. I told her I had worked on 4 suspension bridges, 2 cable stays, and a pedestrian overpass that I was privately more proud of than any of the larger structures because of a specific constraint problem we'd had to solve with the foundation. She asked about the constraint problem. I explained it. She asked 2 follow-up questions that indicated she had actually listened to the first part. I noticed, in some peripheral part of my awareness, that this was the most engaged I had felt in a conversation in quite a long time. We talked about the sound a hospital makes at 2 in the morning, the particular rhythm of it, the way footsteps in the corridor have a different quality than footsteps anywhere else, purposeful in a way that makes you aware of your own non-purposefulness. We talked about fear, not our fears specifically, but the nature of it, the way it doesn't behave the way you think it will, the way it tends to to arrive sideways rather than straight on, sneaking in through the smaller doors when the large ones are locked. She said she'd spent the first 2 days waiting for a specific kind of fear, and it hadn't arrived, and what had arrived instead was something more like a very intense calm that she didn't entirely trust. I said I understood that. The calm that feels like it's holding something larger behind it. Exactly, she said. Like a door that's latched but not locked. She asked if my wife was coming in the morning. The question was neutral, informational. I said, she said she'd be there when I was out of recovery. She said, good. And then I didn't say anything because there was something in the way I'd answered the question, something in the rhythm of it, the slight flatness, that apparently communicated more than I'd intended, because she turned her head and looked at me for a moment before looking back at the ceiling. She didn't ask anything else. At 3:11 in the morning, my phone lit up on the nightstand. I read the text, read it again. My hands went from the steady, calibrated steadiness I had been maintaining for 6 weeks, the kind of steadiness that requires constant invisible effort, to shaking in about 3 seconds, the specific shock of a load-bearing surface giving way. She was watching me, not obviously, not intrusively, but the room was very quiet and we had been in it together for 4 hours. Bad news, she said. I held the phone up without answering. I don't know exactly why. Some instinct that required the words to be witnessed by another person before they were completely real. She leaned slightly from her bed and read the screen. I watched her face. It went through something careful and controlled and deliberate before settling into a very specific kind of stillness. The stillness of someone who has decided what they think and is holding it at a particular temperature. She hopes it goes well, she said very quietly. The night before your surgery, a beat. That's a special kind of coward. There was nothing performed about it. No indignation on my behalf, no dramatic sympathy. Just a flat, precise assessment, offered the way you might note the structural flaw in a load-bearing wall, not with heat, with clarity. Something broke in me at that. The thing I had been holding together for 6 weeks with both hands. Not catastrophically, but enough. A crack along a seam that had been under pressure for longer than I had admitted. I laughed. It was a terrible sound, like something giving way politely, like a beam settling under a load it hadn't been designed for. She watched me without saying anything. I said, you know what? And I could hear the specific, unhinged quality in my own voice. The particular pitch of someone at the intersection of genuine terror and sleep deprivation, and the sudden removal of the last remaining pretense. I said, if we both make it out of surgery, we should just get married. Cut out the middleman. Skip straight to the part where someone actually shows up. It was a joke. The tone of it was a joke. The context was clearly a joke. I was a man in a hospital gown at 3 in the morning who had just received a divorce text before a major surgery and was processing it via absurdist humor. She looked at me for a long moment. Okay, she said, and then the door opened and the night nurse came in to do vitals. The nurse was a woman who moved with the particular efficiency of someone 20 years into a job she was very good at. She looked at me. She looked at the woman in the other bed, and her face did something I couldn't immediately classify. Not amusement, not warmth, but something closer to a very controlled alarm wearing the outfit of professionalism. She took my blood pressure without comment. She checked the IV line. She said everything looked fine and wrote something on her chart. At the door, she paused. She looked at me with an expression I still could not categorize. She said, try to get some rest, and then she left. I looked at the other bed. She was looking at the ceiling again. I said, why did she make that face? She said, I don't know what you're talking about. But there was the very faintest quality of something in her voice that I could not identify in the dark at 3:15 in the morning when I was terrified and holding a phone that had just reorganized the architecture of my life. I found out what it was on day 3. But first, I had to survive 7 hours and 22 minutes of surgery. The anesthesiologist's name was on his badge, but I did not retain it. He was a tall man with a focused quality who asked me to count backwards from 10, and I got to 7, and then there was nothing. Not darkness, not dreams, not the passage of time in any experienceable form. Just 7, and then a recovery room and a nurse saying my name and a sensation in my side like something very large and unpleasant, reminding me it was there. My sister was there. She had flown in from out of state the previous evening, a fact I had known about in advance and that had not quite landed as real until I opened my eyes, and she was standing at the foot of the bed looking at me with the particular expression she had worn when she was 12 and I was 9 and I had fallen out of a tree and she didn't know whether to cry or yell at me. She said, you look terrible. I said, Henderson. She said, Henderson is at your neighbor Mrs. Paulson's. He's fine. He ate approximately his body weight in treats. I said, as a question. And I don't know entirely what I was asking with it. Whether I was asking if she was there or whether she'd called or whether some part of me was still hoping for a version of things that had already ended at 3:11 a.m. My wife, my sister's face did something. She said she texted to say she was glad it went well. She texted, not she's in the waiting room, not she called. She texted. My sister put her hand on my ankle over the blanket. She said, I'm here. That was the sentence in the end. Quiet and plain and completely sufficient. Dr. Patel came to see me at 2 in the afternoon, 14 hours after I had ceased counting backwards. He had the satisfied, measured manner of a man who had done his job well and was prepared to report on it factually and without excessive drama. He said they had achieved clean margins. He said the mass had been removed entirely. He said pathology would take several days, but that he was cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. I held those 2 words in my hands and turn them over. They were not cured. They were not even close to the ease of cured, but they were oriented in the right direction, which at that particular moment was more than sufficient. My sister stayed for 4 days. She slept on the uncomfortable fold-out chair in my room and argued with me about whether I was eating enough of the hospital food, and brought Henderson in on the second day, having somehow convinced the ward staff that he was a registered therapy animal, which he is not, but which my sister maintained with such serene confidence that no one thought to check. Henderson curled up against my feet at the bottom of the bed and went immediately to sleep. This was, I think, the best I had felt since March. On the third day, I asked a nurse about the woman in the next room. Her name was on the tip of my tongue. Her first name, the one she'd given me at 2 in the morning in the quiet of the pre-op ward, and I used it when I asked. The nurse, a man in his late 30s named Terrence, with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned not to rush anything that didn't require rushing, looked at me with a carefully neutral expression. "She made it through," he said. Something in my chest loosened in a way that I hadn't known was clenched. She came to my room on the afternoon of day 3. Dark trousers, a silk blouse, the color of a November sky, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose body had been recently and significantly rearranged and was recalibrating on its own terms. In one hand, a paper cup from the hospital cafe on the ground floor, the one I had passed 3 times being walked by my sister without ever stopping at. She held it out. "Terrible coffee," she said, "but you've earned it." She sat in the chair beside the bed without hesitation, not tentatively, not with the practiced politeness of a visitor respecting a patient's space, but with the ease of someone claiming territory she had already decided was hers. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "I heard you woke up asking about me," she said. I said my surgical team had felt it was medically relevant. The corner of her mouth moved. She said, "Do you want to know why the nurse went white?" I said that I did. She said, "I should probably tell you my last name first." And she told me. I want to try to describe what it was like to hear that name in that context, from that person, in that room. I am an engineer. I think in systems and loads and the specific logic of how things hold together under stress. I am not naturally a man who experiences moments cinematically. But when she said her last name, the sensation was something close to the feeling you get on a bridge when the wind takes it. Not the dangerous kind of movement, but the intentional kind. The flex that means the structure is doing what it was designed to do. Processing, adjusting. The name had weight, not because of money, though the money was not abstract, but because of what I knew was attached to it. What everyone in the city knew was attached to it. I looked at her. Then I looked through the interior window in the door at the wall of the corridor outside. At the brass plaque I had walked past on my way to the bathroom on 2 separate occasions without paying it more than a glancing, peripheral attention. The name on the plaque was the name she had just said. The wing of the hospital I was sitting in. The Oncology Research Center. The expanded surgical unit. The patient advocacy program whose business card Terrence had quietly left on my tray table the morning after my wife's 3 a.m. text. Without comment. The way you leave an umbrella by the door of someone who hasn't checked the weather yet. All of it. I looked back at her. She was watching me with the quiet, patient attention of someone who had watched this specific realization arrive on many faces before and had learned to wait for it to complete. The nurse, she said, was not startled by a man proposing to a stranger at 3 in the morning before surgery. She was startled that the man proposing did not seem to know who he was proposing to. I said, "You said okay." She said, "I did." I said, "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee cup. When she looked up, her expression was the same controlled precision she had worn at 3 a.m., but something underneath was fractionally more open, the way a door looks when it's been unlocked but not yet pushed. "My ex-husband," she said, "left when my company went public. He said he had married a woman, not a brand. He preferred me as something he could contain. I have spent 6 years being told that the version of me that has built something real is the version that is difficult to love, that I am too much, too focused, too unwilling to arrange my life around someone else's convenience." She met my eyes. And then a man in a hospital gown who had just had his marriage end in a text message before major surgery. She paused. "You asked me in a way that had nothing to do with what I have or what I control. You just saw a person in the dark who seemed like a reasonable companion for whatever came next. You didn't know. So it wasn't about any of that. It was just..." She stopped, shook her head slightly. "It was just someone actually seeing me," she said, in an uncomplicated way, for about 10 seconds. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that would improve on what she'd just said. My phone buzzed on the tray table. We both looked at it. My wife's name on the screen. Not a text this time. A call. The woman in the chair beside my bed looked at the screen. Her expression didn't change, but her stillness became a different quality of stillness, the kind that is not passive but chosen. I answered it. I don't know entirely why. Some need for the thing to complete itself. To hear the voice and have it be what I already knew it was, rather than what I had spent 11 years believing it was. She was at home. Her voice had the measured, careful quality of someone who had prepared what they were going to say. She said she was glad I was okay. She said we needed to talk about next steps. She said her lawyer. I said, "You already have a lawyer." A pause. Then, "I've had one since February. 4 months before the surgery. 6 weeks before the diagnosis. Almost exactly." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over. The way the leave policy question had been delivered that first night. The practicality I had characterized as love. She had been doing a different kind of math. Preparing the architecture of an exit while I was learning, alone, in waiting rooms, that my body body had something in it that was trying to take up more space than it was supposed to. I said, February. She said, I needed to be prepared. It's not personal. Is he there? I asked. A pause. I said, you know who I mean. The pause confirmed it faster than any answer. His name, I said. She said a name. Her colleague. Someone I had met at company events, shaken hands with, had at our dinner table twice the previous year. Someone I had thought seemed decent. He was there in February, I said. She didn't answer. I said, the house. She said, I need you to be reasonable about the equity. My lawyer says this can be clean and quick if you cooperate. The woman in the chair beside my bed reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. She set a small card on the tray table beside my phone. Clean, minimal, heavy stock. A name, a title. Patient and Family Advocacy Services. An organization I had seen referenced twice in the ward without understanding what it was. I said into the phone, I have representation. My wife said, your sister? No, I said, someone else. The woman leaned forward slightly toward the phone. Her voice, when she spoke, was the voice of someone who had addressed government committees and international boards, unhurried, carrying the specific gravity of a person who has never needed volume to be taken seriously. She said a name, her full name, the name I now knew. The silence on the other end of the phone had a different quality than any silence I had heard from my wife in 11 years. It was not the silence of someone composing a response. It was the silence of a complete recalibration. She said, without raising her voice, your husband is a post-surgical patient in a medical facility where I have a particular relationship. Any attempt to pressure him regarding assets or legal proceedings while he is in this building will be documented. The marital home should not be further occupied by non-resident parties. Financial accounts should remain frozen. If either condition is violated, documentation will be delivered to opposing counsel within the hour. A pause. Additionally, she said, the timeline of legal consultation that began in February while your husband was undergoing cancer diagnostics alone is a matter of record. Courts find that kind of timeline relevant to good faith assessments. She paused. I hope that's clear, she said. My wife hung up. My sister, who had been in the corridor and who had apparently come to stand outside the door at some point in the preceding 2 minutes, opened it and said, I have no idea what is happening, but I am choosing to be very glad about it. Henderson, from his position at the foot of the bed, thumped his tail twice. The woman in the chair looked at me. So, she said, with the absolute composure of someone who negotiates for hospitals in her spare time. Still want to skip the middleman? I looked at her for a long moment. I said, I stress test everything I'm going to commit to. She said, how long does that take? I said, depends on the structure. She nodded. She finished her coffee. She stood up, moving carefully, with the precise economy of someone conserving resources. She said, I'll be here tomorrow if you want to continue the structural analysis. And she walked out. My sister came in immediately after, looked at the empty chair, looked at me, looked at the card on the tray table and said, who was that? I told her the name. My sister sat down in the chair. She said nothing for about 45 seconds. Then she said, the hospital wing. I said, yes. She said, the plaque in the hallway. I said, yes. She looked at the empty doorway. She said, you asked her to marry you as a joke. I said, technically. She said, okay. My sister put her face in her hands. Then she started laughing. It was the kind of laughing that takes over your whole body and doesn't stop for longer than is dignified. Henderson lifted his head from the foot of the bed and looked at her with the patient, slightly concerned expression he used for most human behavior he couldn't categorize. I let her laugh. I looked at the card on the tray table. I looked at the plaque visible through the window in the door. I thought about a woman staring at a ceiling at 2 a.m. saying, it doesn't have any answers. I thought about the particular quality of her stillness when she read the text. The flatness of, that's a special kind of coward. I thought about, okay, Dr. Patel came in for his afternoon rounds and found my sister still wiping her eyes and me looking at the ceiling, and he asked if everything was all right, and I said, cautiously optimistic. He seemed satisfied with that. Pathology came back on day 6, fully resected, no lymph node involvement. The word cure was still being held at a distance, but optimistic appeared in every report, and Dr. Patel used the word excellent twice in the same sentence, which he had not done before, and I understood that to mean something. My sister flew home on day 7. She hugged me for a long time at the door of the ward and said, call me every day and eat the food even when it's terrible, and if you end up engaged to a billionaire before you leave this hospital, I want to hear about it from you, not the internet. I said I wasn't going to end up engaged. She gave me a look. I said I was going home in 2 days. She said, you have terrible pattern recognition. She was not wrong about that. The days in the hospital after my sister left had a specific quality that I have tried to describe to people and found I cannot do it justice in ordinary language. There is something about convalescence, real convalescence, the kind where you have been opened up and put back together, and your body is doing its slow, extraordinary work of deciding you are worth keeping, that strips away the pretense of ordinary time. You are not managing a schedule. You are not optimizing. You are simply existing, which it turns out is harder and more interesting than it sounds. She came in the afternoons, not every day. She had her own recovery, her own schedule, her own life that existed outside a hospital room in ways I was only beginning to understand, but often enough. She would bring coffee and sit in the chair beside my bed, and we would talk the way we had talked at 2 a.m. on the night before our surgeries, with the particular ease of people who have already established that the important things are not going to be avoided, so there is no need to manage the approach to them. She talked about her mother. Her mother had died in this hospital 17 years ago, in a ward that no longer longer existed in the form it had taken then. It had been rebuilt, refunded, restructured, the odds improved by a margin she had spent 15 years calculating and then spending. The grief had done what grief does when it is given somewhere to go. It had not diminished so much as transformed, finding its way into the work rather than just sitting in the body accumulating weight. I talked about bridges, the specific physics of tension and compression. The way a suspension bridge is not, as most people imagine, a static object held in place. It is a dynamic system in constant negotiation with its own forces, the loads and the counterloads, the movement that looks like stillness. The ones that fail, I told her, are the ones designed for rigidity. The ones that stand are designed to move. She listened to this in the way she listened to everything, with absolute attention, taking it in, turning it over. Most people think about relationships the way they think about rigid structures, she said, built to hold a fixed load forever. I said, they're not though. No, she said. She was quiet for a moment. They're not. I did not miss the implication. Neither of us acknowledged it directly. We were both, I think, old enough and bruised enough to understand the difference between a genuine connection formed under extraordinary circumstances and the foundation of something that could hold weight in ordinary ones. We had both come from structures that had failed. We were not in a hurry to build anything that might fail the same way. But she came back, and I was glad when she did. I was discharged on a Thursday. My neighbor brought Henderson to the front entrance of the hospital, and he launched himself at me with such complete disregard for my recent surgical status that Mrs. Paulson said she was sorry. She'd tried to warn him, and I said it was completely fine, even though the impact had compressed things that were still tender, because Henderson's quality of missing someone is such that it is impossible to be anything but grateful to be the object of it. The house felt strange, not unfamiliar. I had been in it for 4 years. I knew every sound it made, every quality of light at different hours, but my wife's things were still there. Not all of them. She had apparently collected what she needed while I was in the hospital. Some negotiated arrangement I hadn't been party to, but enough. A coat still on the hook by the door. 2 books on the nightstand I recognized as hers. The particular brand of tea she drank in the morning, on the second shelf of the pantry, right where it had always been. I left the tea there for 3 weeks before I moved it. Patricia O'Shea was 61 years old, had 30 years of matrimonial litigation behind her, and had the manner of someone who found the worst of human behavior neither shocking nor especially interesting, just material to be worked with. She had come recommended through the Advocacy Network, a quiet referral, made without fanfare, by a woman who apparently made a habit of ensuring that people who needed the right help found it. We met on a Tuesday morning in her office. She looked at what I had, asked what I wanted, and said, "Let me see what she's built." What she had built, it turned out, was not particularly well concealed once you knew where to look. The legal consultation beginning in February, 4 months before I filed, time-stamped in a system that did not care about anyone's narrative. Financial transfers from joint accounts over 8 months, small enough individually to seem incidental, collectively forming a pattern. Hotel reservations, going back to the previous spring. She planned this carefully, Patricia said in our second meeting, spreading the documentation across her desk with the dispassionate tidiness of someone arranging evidence rather than telling a story. She is not stupid. She's just not as careful as she thinks. I sat with the hotel reservations for a long time, not because they surprised me, something had already assembled the shape of it without me looking directly, but because of the dinner parties, the handshake at the holiday party, the ordinary intimacy of a man you believed was peripheral, turning out to have been central for longer than you knew. 11 years of marriage, 4 years of good ones. How many of the remaining 7 had been contaminated at their edges, and how many of those edges had I chosen not to examine? These were not productive questions. Patricia told me firmly and specifically that they were not productive, and she was right, and I kept arriving at them anyway in the way you keep arriving at a bruise with your fingers. Not to assess it, but because the soreness is still somehow orienting. The settlement took 4 months. It was not clean, and it was not quick. It was thorough, which is a different thing. Patricia was methodical in the way of someone who does not need to hurry because the material is sufficient. The February timeline sat over every negotiation like weather. My wife's lawyer tried twice to characterize the timeline as coincidental and was referred twice to the documentation. Coincidence is harder to maintain than people expect when it is this specific and this legible. I kept the house. I kept Henderson. I lost the particular structure of the life I had believed I was living and had to undertake the slow, unglamorous, non-optional work of understanding what I actually had. This is harder than people who haven't done it suggest, and easier than people in the middle of it believe. You cannot see the distance you're covering while you're covering it. You can only see it in retrospect, when you turn around and look back at where you started. She and I continued our coffee. The hospital cafe was replaced when we were both recovered enough for wider geography by a decent espresso place 3 blocks from St. Augustine's, a narrow room that smelled of good beans and wood and had 4 small tables, 2 of which were almost always taken. We met there once, 2 weeks after my discharge, then again the following week. Then, without formal decision or announcement, it became the kind of recurring appointment that starts appearing in your calendar because the alternative, not having it there, is less interesting. We were careful, both of us. We had come from things that had cost us, and we were not inclined toward caution. We did not rush toward anything. We moved in the way of people who have learned that the structures worth trusting are the ones that build slowly, that test each load before adding the next, that do not assume their her own integrity but demonstrated over time. She told me about the foundation her mother had inspired, the early years of it, when it had been grief wearing the clothes of philanthropy, and she had known the difference and kept going anyway. The way the work had slowly, over 15 years, become something she did for its own sake rather than as a channel for something that needed channeling. The particular satisfaction of watching the odds improve, not in the abstract, but in the specific, measurable language of 5-year survival rates, of clean margins, of words like cautiously optimistic becoming simply optimistic. I told her about bridges, more of them. Not just the physics, but the history, the ones that had failed and what they taught the ones that came after. The Tacoma Narrows, designed too rigid, destroyed by the wind it hadn't been built to flex with. The lesson being, what you don't account for doesn't disappear. It finds a frequency. She said, that's the most useful thing anyone's ever said to me about my marriage. I said, mine too, technically. She smiled at that. A real smile. Not the controlled, composed expression she offered the world by default, but the other one. The one that arrived in flashes and was gone before you could analyze it. I found that I looked forward to the flashes. 1 year after surgery, I was asked to say a few words at the foundation's annual gala. She had asked me, which meant I could not say no, though I could and did argue that I was an engineer and therefore congenitally unsuited to podiums. She said, you explain things clearly. That's all a speech is. I stood at the podium in a hall I could not have imagined being in a year earlier and said something close to true, that the worst night of my life happened in a hospital room. That losing the life you thought you had is terrifying, precisely because it requires you to look at what was actually there, what was real and what was maintained. That the particular mercy of a genuine crisis is that it strips away everything you've been choosing not to see. That survival, both kinds, is the beginning of the work, not the end of it. She was in the third row in a dark dress, pretending to review something on her phone, but I could see that she was watching me with the patient, complete attention she gave to everything she decided was worth her time. Nurse Patrice, the nurse from the pre-op ward, who had come in to check my vitals at 3:15 in the morning and had recognized, in that one extraordinary moment of coincidence, exactly who it was I didn't know I was talking to, was at a table near the back. She looked deeply satisfied in the way of someone who has been present at the beginning of something without being responsible for it. Afterward, outside on the venue steps, the city doing what cities do around the edges of formal events, she stood beside me and looked sideways. You said you were bad at public speaking, she said. I said, I am bad at public speaking. She said, the bar was fine. You cleared it. We were quiet for a moment. The specific comfortable quiet of people who have stopped performing patience for each other and are just living in the same moment. I said, you said okay. She turned to look at me. She knew what I was doing. I said, at 3 in the morning, in the dark, when I made a terrible joke about getting married. She said, I did. I said, were you serious? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at me with the expression I had come to understand was her thinking face, not blank, but internally active, processing, precise. I am a structural engineer, I said. I don't commit to anything I haven't stress tested. She said, and? I said, 12 months, different loads, different conditions, static and dynamic, expected and unexpected. She said, what's the result? I looked at her. 11 years of believing something I should have looked at directly. 1 year of looking at this directly, in the light, with both eyes open. No explanations required. No interpretations offered to cover what I was actually seeing. I said, the result is that I would like to ask you something. Not as a joke this time. Not at 3 in the morning, in daylight, with full information, as a person who knows exactly who he is talking to. She was very still. I said, would you like to skip the middleman? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, okay. Same word, same voice, completely different night. And outside a hospital where her name was on a wall and mine was on a patient file that said clean margins and cautiously optimistic and eventually, quietly, just clear. She said okay and meant it. And the city moved around us, and somewhere across town, Henderson was sleeping on Mrs. Paulson's couch, and everything that had failed had been the prerequisite for everything that was about to hold.